Okay, let's have a look at basic authentication. And as I said, there is no built-in basic authentication middleware, so we have to build it our own. Now, already know in theory how that works, and that's how the code looks like. So, as I said, we always start with the authentication options class. So I created a basic authentication options class, which derives from this base class. And the things we need basically are the realm. That is part of the basic authentication spec. We need to send back this value, which is, like your application name or your domain name or something, which tells the client in which context the credentials he is going to send will make sense. And we need a credential validation function, which is basically a callback so you can validate the incoming username and password. And then we call the base class constructor, and what this is doing is it sets the authentication type. So remember, I said every Katana middleware, Katana authentication middleware has a name, so to speak, and they call it authentication type, and that's how you set that. And then we set the realm, we set the function, and the authentication mode defaults to active. Okay, so then let's have a look at the authentication handler, which is, the thing that does the heavy lifting. And basically we construct here this text that we're going to send back as the header if we need to. And then all of the work is done in the authenticate or core async method. So what we're going to do here is we have a look at the authorization header, and if that is present, we have a look at if it starts with basic, and if that is the case, we're going to move on. Otherwise, we just return null. Null means there's nothing to do, go on. I don't have any claims identity for you. We're going to trim the header, so we remove the basic in front and then pass on basically our header to this method here, which extracts it and calls the validation function. So let's have a look how that looks like. So in here, basically, we take that string, get the decoding from base 64. If something goes wrong, we return null. Then we check for the colon, and there must be a colon in there because that's the thing that separates the username from the password. If not, we return null. Then we split the two strings, and then we are calling our validation callback. And this will basically return the claims like this. Okay, so if that is all good, we create a claims identity as you've seen before, pass in the claims, pass in the authentication type, and then this is part of the Katana plumbing. We create an authentication ticket, and the ticket holds the claims identity, and it can hold, and that's why we have this wrapper class for that, additional properties that you can pass along the pipeline, which are called authentication properties. We don't use them here, so it's just an empty object. Okay, so that's the whole authentication logic. And the last thing we have to implement for, at least for basic authentication, is the apply response challenge async method, and that is called on the way back. And what we have to do is basically we have to say, okay, did someone along the pipeline generate a 401, meaning the server wants authentication, so we have to do something now. And then what you do is basically there's a helper class on the base class here, which says, do you have to produce a challenge? And the reason for doing that is, well, because there are more complex scenarios. So when you have more than one authentication middleware registered, and somewhere down the line someone says, I want to authenticate using Google, then you don't have to do anything, but the Google authentication middleware has to do something. So that's basically a helper class saying, do you mean me? I mean, do I have to add something here to the response? And in the case of active authentication methods, that's always the case. In the when you have passive authentication methods as well, then someone might request authentication using a 401, but maybe not via basic authentication. So that's why this helper exists. And it's basically boilerplate code. You just say lookup challenge, you pass in your authentication type, you pass in your authentication mode, and if this challenge thing is not null, then okay, I have to do something, and in our case, to to fulfill the basic authentication protocol, if you like, we have to add the authenticate header and pass in our challenge string, which you've seen in the beginning is basically saying basic realm equals whatever we have provided as a realm. Okay, so that's our basic authentication handler. That's the thing that implements basic authentication. And the thing that glues it together is the basic authentication middleware. And again, that is, middleware stuff, but with a twist, because you're deriving from authentication middleware, you pass in your options, and there's the constructor. You can call the base class to store away this next pointer, if you like, and then the only thing you really have to do, which is non-standard, is you have to implement the create handler method, and inside the create handler you are creating your basic authentication handler, and you can pass the options along. Okay, and the last thing, which is as always optional, but is is kind of like a common pattern with middleware, is that you're providing an extension method for iApp Builder, where you basically say use basic authentication, you pass in, for example, the realm, and you pass in your callback function, and then under the covers we are wiring up our middleware. Okay, so that's how it works, and regardless of what type of authentication mechanism you want to implement, that's always the same. You inspect the incoming request in authenticate core async, you provide the challenge in apply a response challenge async. The rest is really boilerplate code, if you like. Okay, so again, we have our controller here, our identity controller, so which requires authentication, and it will send back the claims to the client so we can inspect them, but we don't have any authentication. So now our task would be to wire up basic authentication in our web API, so we can use our extension method. So we have to specify a realm, that's our demo realm, and then some method which implements the credential validation. So validate users, for example. And as you can see, how this method works is we pass in an ID, the username, we pass in the secret, the password, and we send back, if successful, a list of claims. And again, this is async, because maybe you typically, I guess you want to do a database round trip here to go to database, look up the credentials, so you can implement it asynchronously. So let's do a very, very simple logic, if ID equals secret, don't tell anyone. Let's create a new list of claims. Claim, new claim, claim types dot name identifier ID, and maybe a role, something that you get from your database. Foo. Okay. And then you would return that. And you always have two choices here. You could say return task from result enumerable claim, claim, and pass in your claims, for example. Or if you don't want to, or let's say your credential validation failed, for example, then you want to pass back null. So you basically do something like this. Yeah. Or which is an easier way to deal with that stuff, but involves the async keyword. You can write async here, and then you can just say remove claims, or return claims, or return null. That's up to you. The from result is sometimes a little clunky, but yeah. We will just do it like this. Okay, so now that means we have our basic authentication wired up before we hit the web API. So let's try that. Okay, let's go to API identity. And you now see we hit our controller. The controller has the authorize attribute. The authorize attribute sends back a 401 because we are not authenticated. Our apply response challenge async kicks in and sends the challenge. And now, as I said, the browser knows the basic challenge. So we can, let's try DOM and XXX. This doesn't work, doesn't fulfill our password policy. Let's try DOM and DOM. And indeed now we have a name identifier claim of DOM, and we have roles, or one role with a value of foo. Okay, so that's how basic authentication works. As I said, that is not, whenever you are implementing basic authentication, ask yourself, is this really what I want to do, or should I go to token-based authentication instead? Which doesn't exclude username password authentication in the first place, but gives you a more robust mechanism after the initial authentication. Cool, so we've seen how it works in the browser. Let's actually create a client. So let's go console, let's create a client here. And let's again add the Web API client library. Stable only, that's good enough. Client library. And I guess that's more or less boilerplate code. New HTTP client. Let's set the base address, new URI, HTTPS, localhost, colon 44309 and /API. Yep, this time I don't forget the final slash. And then we do our response equals client.get async identity.result. And we want to make sure ensure status code, and then we say var content equals response dot content read as string async dot result and console write line content. Okay, let's quickly make sure I got the base address right, 44309. Good. Let's set the startup project to current selection. And what we would expect now is a 401, right? So let's run the client. Indeed, 401 unauthorized. So now how do I set a basic authentication header? Well, basically what you have to do is you have set the authorization header. You have to take the username, colon, the password, and base64 encode that. And I have a little helper library that is on NuGet. It's called ThinkTexture Identity Model.client. Here, it's also a portable library, which means it runs again on desktop, Windows 8, Windows Phone 8. Okay. And this has a little extension method called set basic authentication, which does exactly what I just described. So when I say DOM, DOM, it sets the authorization header, does all the encoding and so on. And now you can see we get back a valid response.